this afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming in this gorgeous Friday fall afternoon. And indeed, I'm so thrilled because it is the day, of course, before fall break. So you guys are all hardcore because you're all here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Farhana Ibrahim, who, as some of you know, is an associate professor of sociology and social anthropology in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. Prior to joining that faculty, she actually taught in Mumbai at TIS, which I know some of you are also familiar with, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Farhana has a number of degrees, which actually struck me as kind of interesting. I did not know, in fact, that she did her BA in history and then clearly jumped ship and realized that there were greener pastures. And she found those in sociology. So she did her BA in history from Delhi University and subsequently an MA and an MPhil in sociology from the University of Delhi, after which she came over to the States, where she did a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Cornell University in 2000, which she completed in 2006 before returning to India to teach. I can admit that my acquaintance with Farhana goes back to her time at Cornell, where she had the perhaps challenging experience of being in the first class I ever taught on my own. So the ink was actually not dry on my dissertation. I undoubtedly had no idea what I was doing, but it was, but I feel like we weathered two, in fact, amazing experiences together over the course of the year. The first was that we experienced 9/11 together. I was teaching that morning. And so didn't learn about the events of that morning until later in the day. It's kind of etched in my memory. And the other thing was that during that year, I taught a course on the partition of India. And I do remember discussions with Farhana because in the spring of 2002, we were all dealing with the pogroms in Gujarat. And there was a very disturbing kind of recursiveness to history as we would read on our email these reports coming in on what was happening. So it was for me, it was a momentous year for me in many ways, but not least of that was the opportunity to make Farhana's acquaintance and to get the chance to befriend her. So please welcome her to the University of Michigan. Thanks, Farhana.
Thank you. Thank you, Farhana, for that very generous introduction. So I'm basically going to read my paper today, and I'm going to start with a small anecdote that will help situate this paper within the context of the larger project. And it's still very much work in progress, and so I would welcome your comments and critical reflections afterwards. Okay. It was a chilly January afternoon in a small village in central Kutch, a district in Gujarat. My research assistant and I had finished with our interviews for the day and were waiting for a bus to return to Bhuj, the district capital. Someone informed us that the 4:30 had been discontinued. There were no more buses scheduled for the day. A biting wind had picked up, and the bus shelter began to fill with men lighting up their bidis as they wrapped their woolen shawls more tightly, their talk turning to politics and the recently concluded elections to the state assembly. Just as we were about to leave in search of some other means of transport, a young woman approached us, speaking in Hindi. I turned around in surprise. It was highly unusual to find a Hindi-speaking woman in the area. Moreover, one who had had the temerity to walk into a public space on the street dominated by men, as she had just done, was practically unknown in my experience in the region. I had just spent the better part of the day interviewing women of all ages in the village, our conversations held in a mixture of Gujarati and Kutchi. I would have been happy to have had someone to talk with in a language I considered myself to be more fluent in. She introduced herself to me as Seema, not her real name, it's a name that I'm using for her, from Udaipur, in the neighboring state of Rajasthan. She told me she was relatively new to the village, having moved here after her marriage 4 months previously. Why didn't you join our meeting, I asked her, but Seema simply shrugged off the question. Suddenly a flicker of recognition dawned. I had caught a glimpse of her on a visit here the previous week. The women I was meeting with at the time were dismissive of her and told me that she was from Rajasthan and she could not have had anything relevant to add to our conversation. While not fully convinced about this explanation at the time, I had let it slide and had more or less forgotten about it. Now, at the bus stop, Seema wanted to know who we were and what brought us to the village. I asked if she was the only person from Rajasthan in the area, thinking that perhaps she could introduce me to others, but she shrugged again and said she did not know. The following week, I was back in this village again. This time, I was with the outreach team of a local NGO that worked with rural women artisans. I asked Priyaben, a member of the outreach team, whether she knew anything about Seema. Oh yes, she explained in front of the other women, the girl from Calcutta, that is Kolkata in West Bengal. I have never heard her open her mouth. I have tried and tried to get her to participate in our sessions, but she won't move from her house. Looking meaningfully at the other women, she said, "You must encourage her to go out and about and to overcome her shyness. Otherwise, how will she ever settle down into her sasural, her final home?" The women looked on in silence, and we began the day's session as though Priyaben had not spoken at all. On our drive back to Bhuj that day, I asked Priyaben why she had referred to her as the girl from Calcutta, when I had been told distinctly she was from Rajasthan, both by the women of the village and separately by Seema herself, when she came up to me at the bus stop. Furthermore, none of the women addressed by Priyaben made any effort to correct her mistake in referring to Seema as from Calcutta rather than Rajasthan. And finally, Seema certainly did not seem to be a shy and reclusive person, as our encounter at the bus stop had already demonstrated. So what exactly was going on? Priyaben turned to me and explained that Seema was actually one of the many Bengali brides who had been bought, kharid ke, from Calcutta by her husband, who had traveled to Bengal to bring her back. However, the family was very afraid of her presence being detected by the police, so they tried to cover up her ethnicity, saying instead she was from Rajasthan. Since she spoke Hindi, this was a good enough cover for now. Soon she would be able to blend in once she had learned the local language and customs, and her shyness was a good excuse for not having to bring her out in company, where her lack of facility in the local language would have otherwise given her away to the police and other surveillance agents as being from outside, notably from Bengal. Now, in contemporary Kutch, there is much media and bureaucratic interest in the growing numbers of women designated as Bengali or Bangladeshi who have moved to Kutch after marrying local men. This discourse illegalizes the predominantly Muslim women migrants in Kutch, variously as illegal border crossers, trafficked women, or as victims of forced marriages. These various constructions of illegality coalesce for the most part into the figure of the Bangladeshi migrant in India, who is very much the iconic illegal migrant, much as the Mexican migrant has been discussed in the United States, whose illegality is inhabited as a perpetual condition of deportability. I draw here on Nicholas de Genova's work. While some of this xenophobia around Muslim migrants is the South Asian configuration of the global war on terror, as it uses the justification of national security to deny Muslim citizens, to deny Muslim claims to citizenship and residency rights, or even refugee status, as seen most recently in the Rohingya refugee exodus from Myanmar. But it also has a very particular historical context in the debates around the question of migration and citizenship in the early years following the partition. A proposed citizenship amendment bill tabled in the Indian Parliament in 2016 seeks to grant citizenship to potential aspirants regardless of the legal status of their border crossing based on religious identity. While Hindus are constructed as quote-unquote natural citizens entitled to refugee status, Muslim migrants from neighboring countries, or for that matter even from other states within the country, are designated as infiltrators. Migrant status is thus illegalized through such discursive exercises, the designation of refugee or infiltrator, for example. The boundary between the legal and the illegal migrant unravels in the context of the large-scale migration of Muslim women into the district from other parts of northern and eastern India. Now, this phenomenon has been designated by sociologists and anthropologists as cross-region marriage migration. When most migrants are designated as Bangladeshi, this becomes a way of attributing illegality to their status as outsiders, regardless of the nature of the borders they have crossed to come here, whether they are national, regional, religious, or linguistic, for instance. Illegality is therefore not a fact given in law, attested to by the presence or absence of paperwork, for instance, but is actively produced through encounters between various forms of regulation and policing that generate the legal and the illegal as relational rather than as fixed categories. Here I'm drawing on the work of Deborah Poole, among others. The fuzzy boundaries between the perception of religious and national identity in these cases suggest that the margin does not only exist as a stable set of relations within the nation, that is, as a demographic or a socio-religious category, as women or Muslims, for instance, but encourages us to ask who is deemed worthy of inclusion as a citizen in the first place and how this is done. Now, one of the sites where the margin between legality and illegality is produced in the evaluation of women's mobility is its designation as either marriage or trafficking, as the two possible legal registers for women's mobility. It's either legal in one case and illegal in the other. The existing literature on global cross-border marriage migration focuses on three broad themes. First, it engages with the question of women's agency by arguing that marriage migration is a form of aspirational mobility that enables women to chart life courses for themselves in a manner that is not adequately captured through the lens of trafficking. While this is a significant point, in many of these studies, marriage is still contrasted more or less absolutely with trafficking, and both are treated as somewhat stable categories with reference to each other. Much of the anthropological focus remains on the institution of marriage itself, which is described as being flexible enough to absorb different kinds of mobilities. The effects of border crossing on the institution of marriage are discussed as traditional gender and family codes are suggestively reformulated in the encounter with nation-state and immigration regimes. In contrast to this, I suggest that these two categories of marriage and trafficking should not be seen as stable and oppositional entities, but instead one could look at how a zone of legality and illegality is produced between them in a contingent sort of way. A second focus for this body of work is on the relationship between global marriage migration and citizenship, and this relates to how these marriages are made legible to the state through citizenship documents and immigration procedures. Again, in this paper, I will argue that citizenship is not evident through paperwork necessarily. The relationship between transparency and paperwork, legality and illegality is somewhat more complicated and contingent. And finally, a subset of this literature suggests that globalization leads to an increase in the scale of transnational women's migration, although as with other types of migration, both internal and transnational, women's mobility ought to be located within a longer duration of mobility that allowed networks of affect and economy to flourish across borders. In South Asia, the partition of the subcontinent in 1947 is usually associated with large-scale migrations across newly created political divisions and the creation of new regimes of citizenship. While the reconstitution of political boundaries in 47 and 71 did indeed lead to significant cross-border mobility, these dates do not necessarily constitute a watershed of movement in an otherwise sedentary society, and this is something we know. South Asians have clearly been crossing borders for some time, whether it was as part of indentured labor, mercantile networks, and so on. South Asian histories of migration, therefore, need to be located within a framework that goes beyond narratives of partition and its aftermaths. Further, these histories of mobility must also pay special attention to women as migrants in their own right. Now, while the 19th century migration of women across the Western Indian Ocean that I discuss in this paper does not merit a seamless comparison with the much more contemporary phenomenon that has been termed marriage migration, but I bring these two sets of debates together to make a larger point about regimes of surveillance with regards to the mobility of women, which, on the one hand, has a much longer history than the contemporary moral panics about cross-region marriage migration in Kutch. Second, it is in the jurisdictional ambivalences of the context in which the British were attempting to strengthen their control over a highly mobile population of both men and women in the 19th century that one can perhaps better appreciate the manner in which the construction of women's mobility operated in the interstices of what could be designated or legal or illegal at a particular point in time. Okay. Now, by the 19th century, merchants from the princely state of Kutch had been traveling across the seas for a while, establishing long-lasting trade connections in places like Muscat and Zanzibar. They were a heterogeneous bunch. Among them were elite merchants, many of whom had settled in Arabian ports long before the East India Company arrived in India, and whose affairs were quite mixed up with the local Arab population, so much so that the British found it quite impossible to tell them apart. Some of them managed business interests that straddled borders and operated out of multiple political jurisdictions, as when brothers lived and managed branches of the family firm from different ports, such as Mandvi in Kutch, Bombay, and Muscat. There were also other less elite groups that were part of this trans-oceanic mobile world. Itinerant traders, ship captains or nakodas, miscellaneous ship hands and sailors or lashkars, who constituted a multiracial population, a floating population that was recruited by ship owners off and on during the sailing season. These transcontinental mercantile networks constituted an important source of support to the company state, as evidenced by the numerous petitions of loyalty they submitted during times of political disturbances, for example, in Muscat after the death of the Sultan and so on. Kutchi merchants also had somewhat of a monopoly over the slave trade. Now, as the power of the colonial state in India grew in the post-1860 period, the crux of the matter in political terms for the British was to establish their relative authority vis-à-vis the Sultan of Zanzibar over the control of the Kutchi merchant diaspora there, which was said to constitute the wealthiest class of the trading population of Zanzibar. By their own admission, the question was a complicated one for the British, because if they were seen to come down too heavily on the slave trade, penalizing these merchants, the latter might choose the jurisdiction of the Sultan over the British, something they had already begun to do. Faced with the imminent loss of their loyal and wealthy constituents in Zanzibar, the British decided to permit what they termed domestic slavery, which would be restricted to a few slaves, not more than 1 or 2 per family, and to prosecute the commercial buying and selling of slaves, or what they called slave dealing. So Kutchi merchants could now legally remain slave owners, but not slave dealers. And interestingly, this is very similar to the contemporary Indian laws on prostitution in India, so where it's legal to be a sex worker, but not to run a brothel or to solicit customers. So there's this interesting sort of moral gray zone in this kind of the designation of what is legal and what is illegal. These categories of slave owner, slave dealer, were in turn dependent on a demarcation between the domestic and the public, especially when it came to the ownership and transfer or sale of female slaves. There were male slaves too, but they were far outnumbered by women in this region. Slaves were bought and sold. They also circulated as gifts, moving between merchant households, as had been the practice in other parts of Western India throughout the preceding century. The social world of slaveholding was apprehended by the colonial state within a more restricted context as trafficking in unfree persons, who then they attempted to liberate, unless, of course, they could prove, the women could prove that they were in legally binding marital relations. So in 1867, for instance, the British had designated that the act of bringing, settling, and possessing slaves is, according to the criminal laws of India, a crime punishable in a manner less severe than murder, but more severe than theft. But these punitive measures were not always easy to enact. There was always the vexed question of jurisdiction. How were they to determine who was a British subject in an environment of perpetual mobility? Merchant traffic across the Western Indian Ocean had multiple stakeholders, each with their own sets of interests and relations with the colonial state. Ships were typically owned by scions of established merchant houses. Captains and crew were employees with diverse racial and national origins. The ship's registration papers were often transcontinental in scope and not always very transparently so. In all of this, it became increasingly complicated to determine the jurisdictional capacity of the state over the avowed crime of slave traffic. Further, not all the women sought the legal or the bureaucratic category of marriage to render themselves legally transparent to the state. Repatriation became a fairly capacious category that at times enabled women to chart further trajectories of mobility for themselves. On the other hand, sometimes those travels that struck the police as being what they called a clear case of trafficking were often preferred by women over being sent back home. During the 1840s through the 1860s, women found on board merchant ships were detained on the suspicion of being slave women. They were forwarded to the presidency government in Bombay, where their cases were discussed and assessed prior to their being offered repatriation. This meant either being sent back to their state of origin if this could be satisfactorily determined, or it was hoped that they could be, in quotes, speedily disposed of in marriage in Bombay. In the interim, they were housed in institutions such as orphanages or made over to the care of what were known as wealthy and respected Indian households until more permanent homes could be found for them. So port cities along the Indian Ocean maritime merchant network thus became sites for the strict monitoring of ships arriving from overseas. A number of the women detained had made multiple journeys or traveled across the ocean more than once by the time their paths crossed with the British authorities. Further, not all of them were African. A number of women who were detained for questioning seem to have returned to Bombay after a gap of a number of years, during which time they had grown to maturity and did not necessarily speak any Indian language, making it harder for the police authorities to determine what their repatriation would consist of. Literature that traces the development of a legal and social discourse over prostitution and trafficking in 19th century Bombay does not always take into account debates that were taking place in the port city at the same time with respect to the so-called trafficking of slaves. The multiracial order of foreign or immigrant women in late 19th century Bombay was made up not only by European and Chinese sex workers, as has been argued in the literature, living in brothels that were then carefully regulated and policed by the colonial state, but would also have included a vast number of African women who, while they were not counted as prostitutes in the city, were nevertheless germane to the policing of women's mobility and discourses of trafficking as they were crystallizing at the time. Now, what I'll do is I'm just going to give some brief stories and then some ways of thinking about them. And in some of the stories of a few of these women that follow, it will be seen that the boundary between marriage and trafficking was sometimes a fluid one, and at other times both designations were refuted by the women. So I'll just maybe get into a brief description of maybe 2 or 3 cases. Okay. So in 1860, the Fateh-ul Khair, a ship owned by 2 brothers who were merchants operating in partnership based in Bombay and Muscat respectively, were apprehended by a ship of the British Indian Navy on suspicions of its being a slaver. A woman had been found on board. It was assumed that she was a slave, so she was taken into custody. She was identified as an Abyssinian woman by the name Hasina. And she, along with the ship's captain, Haji Ahmad Ali, who was the chief accused in the case, and the ship's crew, were brought to Bombay, where they were detained for detailed questioning. A translator was also brought over from his station in the Persian Gulf to Bombay, especially for this purpose. Now, the case of the Fateh-ul Khair was a long drawn-out one. The prosecution alleged that Ahmad Ali, the ship's captain, had bought Hasina for the sum of $70 at a port in Yemen. This made him a slave dealer, they said, in no uncertain terms. On his part, the defendant argued that Hasina was his lawfully wedded wife, the sum of $70 constituting her marriage portion paid by him to her father. But then when he was asked for a marriage certificate, he could not produce one. In the absence of credible legal evidence of a marriage having taken place between Hasina and Ahmad Ali, a lengthy trial commenced in Bombay. Was the Fateh-ul Khair a slaver or not? Depositions were made by a number of witnesses, including Hasina. The Nakoda, the ship's captain, Ahmad Ali, found unexpected support as time went by from the owners of the ship, who were the most eager for a speedy resolution of a case to avoid losses for the time the ship had remained grounded in Bombay. So one of the brothers petitioned the government, and this petition put forward a forceful case to argue that Hasina was the lawfully wedded wife of Ahmad Ali. It also enclosed the paperwork that the Nakoda had been unable to supply when the ship was originally searched. The petitioner now argued that Hasina was obviously a free woman, as she had been legitimately married under Islamic law in a Qazi court at Yemen, under which legal provisions she was a free woman. The certificate, copies of which were enclosed with the petition, were in Arabic, stating that the marriage portion was fully and completely paid to her, and the marriage is lawful and valid. She is now entitled to what all wives are entitled, and is liable to what all wives are liable. The ship's crew attested to having witnessed the marriage, a public record of which was created on the day of the marriage at the office of the chief Qazi, from where the certificate was taken and sworn to be genuine. One of the witnesses who signed the certificate was none other than the Qazi who had solemnized the marriage. Not being able to nail any evidence against the captain, Ahmad Ali, he was released, but Hasina was curiously kept on in custody, the government's plan being that she would, in quotes, of course, be left in possession of her freedom, and government will no doubt see that she is placed under proper care and in some employment suitable for her, end quote. Time passed in Bombay, and the government solicitor questioned her again with the help of an interpreter, but now she denied having been manumitted by or married to the Nakoda and stated that she believed he bought her to sell her again. By the time Hasina testified the second time, moreover, she appeared to be married to someone else, or in a relationship the police assumed was a marital one. She was residing in Bombay, and she was pregnant, and she did not want to be repatriated and wanted to stay on in Bombay. She came to give her testimony in the company of an older Abyssinian woman deemed to be her present mother-in-law, who was observed by the police to have what they called considerable influence over her. Okay, I'll move on to another case. And in an earlier case, in November 1843, a young woman named Fatima had been detained, a young woman named Fatima gave evidence in Bahrain. She had been rescued by a British agent at Bahrain from the house of an Arab. She testified that she was a resident of Colaba in Bombay and was kidnapped one night by an Arab whilst playing near her father's house. This Arab sold her to another, who in turn married her to one of his slaves, who was a Sindhi, an African with whom she had 2 children. The other key actor in this narrative was Yusuf, an 18-year-old son of a Lashkar, a sailor at Colaba Lighthouse, who had set out from Bombay in search of a sister who was missing for the last 7 years. He arrived in Bahrain and sat by the beach. Shortly afterwards, a man came and asked him if he wanted employment. He replied that he did, and he went with this man to the house of an Arab, and there he saw his sister. The reconnaissance is described in very dramatic terms by the British agent who is transcribing this. The lad Yusuf, when he saw her, said, "She is my sister," and she said, "He is my brother," and they embraced each other. It is assumed throughout that Fatima is Indian, even though she gave her testimony in Arabic and was not very fluent in Hindustani. It was assumed this was because of the young age at which she was brought to Bahrain. The officer taking her testimony wrote, "She states she does not know her brother's name, but on his calling her Noora, said her name was Noora. She was questioned whether she could speak Hindustani. She replied, a little. We found she could not hold conversation in it, and she gave her evidence in Arabic. It is the opinion of the agent and myself in looking at her face that she is an Indian." So Fatima/Noora's origins and identity remained a mystery to the authorities. Inquiries were made in Colaba, but they revealed nothing. The senior magistrate of police in Bombay wrote to the chief secretary to the government, underscoring there can be no doubt of her being an Indian. There are marks about her forehead of the Turki which would lead to the supposition that she was originally a Hindu. So Fatima/Noora was brought to Bombay in accordance with her wishes and asked to identify her place of birth. In her testimony given in Bombay a year later, in 1844, she stated, "I have no recollection of my parents nor of the place of my birth. When I was very young, I was at Basra. I was a slave, and I was sold to Sayyid bin Qasim, who took me to Bahrain. And about a year ago, when I was on the road in Bahrain, a person named Yusuf came to me. He said that I was his sister and the daughter of Muhammad Ali of Bombay. The father of my children is a Sindhi, a slave of the said Sayyid Qasim. I now wish to join my brother," she said, "who told me that he lives at Muscat. I will stay in Bombay if it is the Sarkar's pleasure." And finally, the third story. In 1846, the Sultan of Zanzibar sent Mariam, a captured slave girl, in quotes, to the British agent in Muscat following his intercession at her sale at the slave market in Zanzibar. Now, the agent found it difficult to ascertain from her how she happened to arrive in Zanzibar or who could be formally charged with slave dealing. I mean, that was the main point, to figure out who could be charged with slave dealing on her account. She was deemed to be a native of Bombay, and so she was sent on to the city of Bombay via Muscat. In Bombay, she was placed in accordance with current practice under the care of the superintendent of police, with the hope that he would be able to provide for her, get her suitably married and settled, and so on and so forth. Now, Mariam's statement before the magistrate in Bombay city records that her father was a Hindu Rajput resident of Baroda. She did not recall the names of either parent, both of whom died, she said, when she was young. Her story reflects multiple migrations, the first from Baroda to Bombay, where she was brought after the demise of her parents. She was taken to the house of a prostitute in Bhendi Bazaar, to whom she was sold and with whom she said she remained for about 4 days. Thereafter, an Arab came and purchased her. He kept her on an island for a month. Then he took me to Zanzibar. This is in her words. There he sold me to someone else. Then she was 2 years his slave. Then he sold me to someone else, whose slave I remained for 4 years, who sold her to someone else, who 4 or 5 days afterwards exposed me for sale in the public slave market in Zanzibar. A dalal, or an agent, took me from the market to the house of a gentleman who asked me some questions, gave me some food and some clothes, and sent me to Bombay. So this is the narrative of the British coming to her rescue. My parents were Hindus, but I am now of the Mohammedan faith. I was never married. I do not wish to go back to Baroda. I should wish to be sent back to Zanzibar, but I have no objection to stay in Bombay if I can be provided for. And that is her narrative. Now, the police department in Bombay attempted to get to the bottom of this case, the search for Mariam's enslavers, as well as the question of her own identification, where did she belong. Now, unlike other cases, she had no kin networks, real or fictive, that could be used to negotiate her mobility. There were no brothers with whom she could negotiate travel under legitimate moral sanction of the state, nor evidence of any children through whom she could claim free status under Islamic law, as some others had done. The police then produced in court a woman by the name of Chanda, thinking that she might be the person who had initially sold Mariam. Chanda also, interestingly, had a history of mobility, not a trans-oceanic mobility like Mariam and the other women, but nevertheless she described her life in terms of a circular migration between the city of Bombay and its hinterland. In her statement, she confessed to having migrated from Ratnagiri 13 years previously. This is Chanda, the prostitute who runs a brothel in Bhindi Bazaar. Her first stops were Jognadi, where she lived for 3 years, and then Panvel, where she was based for a year before moving to Bombay city. Apart from her first fortnight in the city, when she said she lived with her mother in a lane off Bhindi Bazaar, she had always resided in the same house as her present abode. She admitted to making occasional trips into the country, but always returned to Bombay. Since Chanda had been resident in this region, in this area, in this neighborhood of Bombay for the past 9 years and a sex worker by trade, it was assumed that she may be able to help the police crack the case of Mariam's trafficking by leading them to the men she named in her statement as having sold her in Bombay initially, or even perhaps by incriminating herself as one of the agents in the trail of sale and purchase of this young woman. The case was not easily put to rest, however, for on being confronted with Chanda, Mariam said she did not know her. Adding to intrigue in this case was a suspicion on the part of the superintendent of police that some sign passed between the policeman who brought Chanda up and Mariam. And this eventually led to this police official being sacked. The case confounded the police department, who were directed by the Bombay government in no uncertain terms to not let up their search and to, in quotes, persevere in their endeavors to trace out the parties by whom this female was reduced to a state of slavery. But in the end, it seems to have been abandoned by the superintendent of police, who noted, "I can get no further clue in this case. I have been able to ascertain nothing further and believe it to be useless to detain the papers any longer." The case proved to be elusive and roundabout, not least because Mariam's testimonies did not help them construct the straightforward narrative they needed. Her narrative revealed that she had cohabited with a number of men, was clearly bought and sold in a typical trafficking sort of narrative, although it was not always clear in what capacity. However, Mariam was equally clear about the fact that she was not married and was equally clear that she wished to go back to Zanzibar, failing which she didn't mind staying in Bombay at the government's expense. In Mariam's case, as with Fatima/Noura, they both rejected marriage as an enabling category that would provide some legitimacy to the border crossing and avoid repatriation. Although they both attested to being bought and sold serially in a classical exposition of a sequence of trafficking that include terms such as kidnapping and abduction, although these, of course, we must remember, are likely not their terms as much as the terms in which their narratives were transcribed, but they do not fall into a straightforward narrative of rescue either. Mariam describes her sequential sale to a series of men, but prefers to be sent back to Zanzibar, failing which, as I just mentioned, she would stay on in Bombay, but she did not want to go back to Baroda, where she said she had been born. In the present, to return to the Bengali, quote, women I began this paper with, there is an attempt on their part to distance themselves from the overly transactional context to their marriages that often include various degrees of what is all too easily read as deception, cash payments made to middlemen, and even sequential cohabitation with a range of men. In other words, actions that could be and are read by the police and middle-class society as the exploitative victimization of women who are too poor to resist. They resist the trafficking narrative by taking recourse to what they see as its only legal alternative, that is the normative South Asian marriage, involving women's migration, and they use the tropes of destiny, that is kismat and naseeb, that it is women's destiny to be sent far away from home and to not know the man they are marrying, and so on and so forth. In this paper, I have tried to attend to the ascription of illegality to migration in terms of a continually rearticulated margin between legality and illegality, marriage and trafficking. This binary was also undercut by the category of race, as rescued women needed to be identified in terms of where they belonged. The women under discussion here had long histories of mobility, even outside of conventional family structures. That is, they were not necessarily migrating as wives or concubines, as the records indicate. Further, all of them did not necessarily lay claim to marriage as an enabling or a bureaucratically legitimate category. Records reveal that during this period, the police department in Bombay was confronted with a confounding array of highly mobile women. It was not easily possible to identify them by race, religion, or nationality because of the multiple displacements they had undergone. While some were recognizably African, like the Abyssinian Hasina and her mother-in-law, others were less easily identifiable, as we saw in the case of Fatima/Noura, and individual officers resorted to ascertaining her religion and place of origin by the way she looked, or the marks left on her face by accessories she is assumed to have worn, which then become assimilated into a certain essentialized category of religion. Interestingly, it's not only the women captured on ships or ports who have this history of migration. Chanda, the sex worker in Bombay's Bhendi Bazaar, had a history of movement between the port city and its hinterland. Further, the interracial nature of these relationships did not pertain to the sexual geographies of colonial and native relationships alone, but had to do with disentangling the Indian from the African. So a lot of time was spent in determining whether these women were Indian or African. What these records do not indicate is how these women were received by the communities of rehabilitation that they were a part of. For instance, what was the relationship between Mariam and Chanda outside of the police station? What was the nature of the sign that the police thought passed between the police and Mariam? As in all the cases discussed in this chapter, in this paper, the narratives are incomplete and merely indicative. I have presented Seema, Hasina, Mariam, and Fatima/Noura stories as narratives that are by definition incomplete. They are not biographies or life histories, which are basically unknowable. They are available to us through multiple displacements in translation as transcribed by police and court officials who are also constrained by official discourses. Nonetheless, it gives us a flavor of a vibrant community of subaltern women who have left significant traces in the archive. There is a fleeting nature to the trails they have left us. I would not go as far as those who have tracked the self-fashioning of Native women through wills and testimonies to argue necessarily that this is how they rendered themselves as subjects with active agency, but I do think that these histories should be included in discussions of women's mobility under conditions of surveillance, and where the legally tenable and untenable, the condition of deportability as it were, is produced in a complex interplay between multiple regimes of social and jural regulation on the one hand and individual agency and desire on the other. Thank you. I finished early.
So we'll do a Q&A, and I'm going to ask Farhana to just call on people.
Sorry. Okay, sure.
Thank you, Farhana. That was really fascinating glimpses of these stories. I was just curious about one category that is perhaps missed if you focus on marriage and trafficking, and that is the category of slaves. Because if you think of the domestic slave, that's not a marriage. I mean, if you think of the various relationships within a household, and especially for the period you're looking at, I mean, is the category of slave and non-slave equally important in thinking about these women? Meaning that is there a sort of colonial or even a later South Asian insistence in seeing marriage there when there could be different kinds of households?
So should I just answer? Yes, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right about talking about that. I didn't actually include the section on the slave and the non-slave here because there was, of course, a lot of discussion going on about, forms of sort of domestic cohabitation. The whole designation of domestic slavery itself has been the subject of a lot of work, where, again, it sort of boils down a little bit to, the colonial state on the one hand trying to criminalize this idea of the slave, under the kind of the abolitionist discourses that they're being received. On the one hand, this attempt to distinguish domestic slavery from sort of Atlantic slavery, which of course, as scholars like Indrani Chatterjee have also pointed out, I mean, there's this problematic sort of a binary between then, the economic sort of exploitative slavery and the household. So I think that entire discussion was certainly going on. Here I'm talking about, in some ways, how the category of marriage was used in many cases by these slave owners, dealers, traffickers, whoever they are. I'm looking at it in this context of mobility, not in the context of the household. So during this period, I think it would be safe to assume that there probably were slaves in households as well, in these various, in a range of sort of intimate relationships that cannot necessarily be classified as marriage. But I'm sort of looking at this moment of, this transactional moment, as it were, this moment when they're kind of movement at ports, at sort of points of entry and points of exit, how the state is sort of receiving these different categories of people. I mean, in a sense, in a precursor to a certain kind of an immigration regime, in a way. Who are you? Where do you belong? What have you come here to do? So I'm looking at it very much in that category, and how then marriage and trafficking become the two sort of legal and non-legal ways of negotiating that entry exit. So yes, there is an entire discussion on the slave in the household, which I have not included right here, but yes, I think it will be useful to think that through as well in relation to this.
I was thinking that because two of your women
Yeah.
don't use marriage.
Yeah, they
And
don't.
the person who uses the marriage is the slave, is the ship owner,
Yes.
right? So your women are caught in a regime where marriage is acceptable, but actually slavery would have been a much more common medium for mobility for a lot of these women at that time.
It would have been common, but at this time, because of the sort of desire to criminalize slavery, it became a little complicated. So once they designated that slave owning was legal, but slave dealing was illegal, it became a little bit of this sort of slightly complex category. Yes.
I really liked your talk. Thank you. And it was just struck me at how much, I mean, obviously you're dealing with an archive that caught some small amount of cases, but it was striking how many resources were devoted to taking the testimony, detaining both the woman and the ship owner or captain, soliciting a translator from the Persian Gulf. And so these were momentous cases, and my question has to do with what else was at stake? Why would those resources be devoted to this in a context where women's lives don't ordinarily merit that much attention? And is there anything like kind of what was happening with sati as I read Lata Mani? Was there anything about this discourse over the legal and illegal woman's body really being a conversation between men about something else?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yes, it is incredible how many resources were deployed to this task. Apart from translators, they had houses, orphanages, all kinds of things. I think, yes, what was at stake here? I mean, I think the answer to that I would trace, like Lata Mani and others who have written on sati and other issues related to women at this kind of period. I think it is really about the control of what is the domestic versus the private, sort of the demarcation of a set of relationships that would be deemed to constitute the domestic and those which would deem not to. I think this, again, so we have so much of this literature in the context of the mainland, in the context of the policing and the regularizing of all of this. I think in this kind of port city context, what makes it so sort of interesting is that how there are so many more categories floating around. And here even the designation of who is a British subject is not just for the women, but also for the men, is really not a very clear and an easy sort of designation to make. So what I didn't talk about was the men, the ship owners and the so-called slave dealers have very, very complicated sorts of paperwork trails that they've left all across the Western Indian Ocean network. But yeah, so I think what was at stake was definitely about a contract between men, about the handling of if we think of it in terms of law, perhaps what is the domain of the civil and the criminal. So I think this would perhaps fit into some of those other discussions that have happened, but in a slightly different way. Maybe I haven't fully thought it through yet, but yeah.
Can I ask another question? Then can we return to your ethnographic vignette at the beginning and what was at stake there in relation?
Right. Again, of course, it's about sort of the people who don't belong, right? I mean, you determine who belongs and who doesn't. As I said, it's this idea of sort of, say, surveillance and immigration and control. And about religion, so determining religion. I mean, I think the other thing that I didn't talk about in so much detail was there's also this entire sort of discourse emerging in the colonial state at this time about the institution of what they call Islamic slavery, right? So this kind of slavery then is also seen to be an institution that is more sort of that you'll find in Muslim households as opposed to so there are these various kinds of classifications and distinctions that are being made based on, today based on nationality and citizenship, at that time based on race and gender and religion in interesting sorts of ways. So I think that's where one would sort of draw a kind of a parallel and see where it goes.
Continuing along Will's line of interrogation, I don't know much about this, but I have come across some evidence in the archives of early 19th century South India that the British were somewhat divided among themselves about this matter of slavery as such. Between those, especially Orientalist scholarly types, who thought that this was a domestic custom that shouldn't be interfered with, as opposed to those reformist types connected with Macaulay, Anglicis, improving types, developers of the theory of tutelage as the theory of liberal theory of empire, and so on, who were against slavery because slavery was bad, and that, in their view, overrode the hands-off Indian culture sort of argument. But it occurs to me that, the abolition of transatlantic slavery by the British in 1835, that's a very different kind of slavery than the domestic slavery of which you speak in India as a long-established institution, you might say. So I think the British side of your exposition is unnuanced, I would say, if you don't mind my saying so. It wasn't unified. In fact, it was the result of a furious clash, a difference of opinion about policy.
No, you're absolutely right.
Those are aspects, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And, I'm sorry if this, it could have been developed a little more. For sure, there were two views on this. But in the context that I've been talking about, I think what came out there were these, different agents in different ports, would sort of, come out with different views about, what they would sometimes call the abhorrent practice of slavery that must be gotten rid of. But what I'm also arguing is that what really trumped during this period, what trumped their decision was the need for political support. They needed political support amongst the mercantile class. They were rich, they were wealthy, they were politically very prominent, and they were also the most prominent slave dealers. And so they had to really decide on which way they would go. And as I've argued, where they did sort of go on the side of permitting what they called domestic slavery, but that's also, of course, come under a certain amount of critique, because if we go with, say, Tanika Sarkar and other sort of arguments, the entire designation of the domestic then becomes a way of actually reinscribing patriarchal authority in the family, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially then as a patriarchal covenant, it's not really talking about the uplift of women's lives or, women's reform or so on. But in this case, it was very, very sort of much premised on their need for loyal allies in a jurisdictional context also, where the Sultan of Muscat, the Sultan of Zanzibar, had their little jurisdictional spaces away from, separately. So these traders could choose the protection of the Sultan instead of the British. And so it was a very kind of a highly competitive sort of domain. And so what I would argue is that their position on slavery here was very much sort of born out of this far more pragmatic political desire to, for power and for, yeah.
But the further complication is the pressure from England at the 1813 Charter renewal for evangelical anti-slavery forces to lift the ban on missionaries, to in other ways adopt a reform India or Indian uplift or whatever point of view that doesn't enter into that.
Yeah, that's something I haven't looked at, but I could. Thank you.
The mic is over on that end, right? Yes.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with Gayatri Bahadur's Coolie Woman?
We were talking about it the other day, yeah.
Okay.
No, I haven't.
I just thought that, her, of course, she's talking about mobility of women in the context of indentured labor in the Caribbean. And her timeline is slightly later than yours. But I think you'll find it very useful conceptually. Because I'm very interested in this rhetoric of rescue, especially since the reference was made to sati, the whole idea of the white man rescuing the brown woman from the brown man that Spivak brings up. I thought it was really interesting when you think about subaltern history, if you're going to, agree with Gramsci that it's necessarily fragmented and that you have to make an inventory of these fragments. So with all the mediations and the difficulties of finding out what is going on, what do you do when you have a fragment? And how do you negotiate subaltern? I thought you were very cautious about the notion of agency, the woman's agency amidst all these constraints. So when does the woman allow herself to be rescued? And when does she actually reject that, paternalistic gesture, I think is interesting. In that fragment that you mentioned, and I cannot remember what the name is, why did she not want to go back to Baroda? Because the reason I'm saying this is Bahadur talks about women, widows, for instance, wanting to flee sati and therefore moving to the Caribbean. So I'm just curious about why she does not want to go back to what I would imagine is her original domestic site.
Thank you. That's very interesting. It's... of course, there could be any number of reasons why she doesn't want to go back to Baroda. She says she doesn't want to go back to Baroda because she doesn't know anyone there. Her parents are dead. And presumably, I think she says she was brought away from there when she was very young, a child. And so Baroda perhaps is a new place for her and, doesn't represent, the feeling of home. It's not a place where she is culturally at home. And so she actually says that she would stay in Bombay if she's provided for, but her first choice is actually to be sent back to Zanzibar, which is where she has spent much of her time. Now, what I find is it's sort of interesting in some of these narratives is if you sort of contrast them with, or if you compare them with some of the narratives in the present about women who are rescued from sex work, etc., right? And very often they too will say that they don't want to go home. right? Because home is what they fled or they left, So this question of agency is something which is sort of quite interesting, which I think very often gets overdetermined, particularly for women's mobility, gets overdetermined with the moral sort of evaluation of what they are doing, right? So in the present as as sex work, or which is and also or in the opening anecdote that I had, as these forced marriages, and they're victims of trafficking, they're victims of forced marriages, so they must be rescued and sent back, but they don't want to go back home. I mean, home is a place which, for better or worse, they have left, and in the present time, a lot of the women who I've spoken to talk about different kind of aspirations in their new life, class mobility maybe, or whatever. And perhaps it was, I mean, again, I can't speak for Mariam in the same way that I can perhaps, talk and discuss more with the women who are in the present, but I think there are grounds to for this kind of reading to these narratives as well.
Thanks for a terrific talk. I really was fascinated by this framing at the movements across whatever you want to call it, a border or something. And I was thinking about what else is doing that. I was thinking about these people. So you have women coming across, but also men, animals, and goods. And I'm wondering about maybe the organization of how they found these people, but also just to what extent were search for origins and things involved in taxation and other kinds of regulation. Was there and the fact that was this ever an issue for men who were slaves, and what does it say about their conceptualization of women, particularly in the way that women were differentially treated from all these other really potentially problematic things coming across, animals, goods of different kinds, and men too? Just
so yes, there were, of course, a whole bunch of other things. What's interesting, though, is at least in the records that talk about these women, the slave sort of thing, there's very little reference to other things. I mean, this would require a broader reading of the archive to see what else is coming through at this time. But much of this is, there are references to what these ships were carrying. They were carrying a range of items, different kinds of goods, different customs duties, different things being taxed. But what's very interesting is that the kind of focus on women in these not even on male slaves. There are a couple of in these records. You hear of men slaves. There are these sort of specially designated water police establishments who are set up at ports, which are supposed to board all ships, to make a sort of survey of them, to match the names of the people on board with the crew list, and to then sort of separate those who are not. So they are sort of told to keep a lookout for women and African boys, right? So that's sort of interesting, right? So so again, there's a certain kind of racialization where young African boys are immediately sort of picked up as slaves, and they are then taken off separately. But then the women are then further sorted, because the women, and I think this is the case in many of them, they're not always entirely sure where they are from. So I think that's a kind of this very interesting kind of thing that goes on, and that's why they sort of detain them further. So I think it's interesting. Yes, there definitely are other things that are coming, but in these records, I find that there is this overwhelming focus on slavery and women slaves who are moving. But it would be interesting to, I think, keep this in mind, these other goods and things, because these ships are, of course, not carrying only slaves. They're carrying predominantly other forms of cargo, and women happen to be on these slaves, on these ships. So yeah, but I'll look at that. Thanks. Yes.
Hey. Thanks, Farhana. So I have 3 questions. Is that legal? You can choose to answer 1, 2, or none. So I'll say that. And the first one I'm going to say is kind of a decidedly, by my own admission, a weird question. Which is that your talk title had in it this issue of the regulation of women's mobility. And I'm actually thinking about this term, women's mobility. And you talk about the moral and legal regulation of it. But in a strange way, I'm just wondering, what does women's mobility there seems to be somehow a sense that there is women's mobility which is somehow being curtailed by these forms that you're talking about. And so I'm just kind of curious to hear you a little bit on how can we imagine women's mobility outside these forms of regulation, or is it even possible, right? I mean, that's kind of a strange question, but it's going around my brain a little bit. The second question was to just ask you to talk a little bit more about the category that seems to have real salience for you in a lot of ways, both for the contemporary and for this historical work, is surveillance. And I know because of a little bit of your other work in the more contemporary ethnographic work, as I recall, surveillance is a really a kind of important analytic for you, it seems. So I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about that. And the last question is more open-ended, to ask about whether, you opened, it kind of pushes a little bit in the direction of Will's question about the relationship between the opening vignette and this historical kind of foray, is to tell us just a little bit more about the broader project that took you into this particular work. So that's a catalog. You can choose.
Okay. So I'll try and answer all three, but I don't know in which order. I can't promise that it'll be in the same order that you asked them. Okay, so maybe I'll start by talking about the last question, actually, and to talk about how my opening ethnographic vignette sort of how this works with respect to the whole. So my work is sort of this current project is actually looking at, well, I mean, my larger work is looking at borders and, the idea of cross-border mobility in a part of the South Asian sort of borderland that is usually assumed to be a kind of non-border crossing area, right? So between Kutch and Sindh, India and Pakistan, it is assumed to be this sort of, very demarcated, closed kind of border. So I'm interested in looking at the different kinds of flows of goods and people across this border through different periods in time. And of course, there have been certain major periods like in 1947, a lot of Hindu Sindhis moved over into Kutch. In 1971, a whole bunch of again Hindus from Tharparkar in Sindh, they move into Kutch, and so on and so forth. So I sort of got interested in this question of women crossing the border. There's a certain way in which the border crossing of men is represented, the illegal border crossing of men as terrorists, as, bearers of arms and contraband and so on and so forth. But I became very interested in the border crossing of women because not only in the present, are there a lot of these women who are called Bengali women who have come from, many of them from Bengal, maybe some of them from Bangladesh. As I said, where they come from is not really as important for my project as the fact that there are these women who are clearly from outside of Kutch, married to local men in the present, and they are heavily surveilled and by the police and intelligence agencies, etc. But then there are a whole bunch of Hindu women who cross over from Sindh, and those marriages are evaluated quite differently. They're also illegal. In fact, they're actually more illegal in the sort of technical sense than a lot of the Bengali women who are coming. Many of them may be Indian, but that this point is overlooked. So then you have many of these Hindu women, coming from Sindh who, don't have papers. They've moved illegally, but this is not seen as trafficking. This is not seen as forced marriage. This is not seen as any kind of, illegal sort of, women's mobility. And then, quite separately in the archives, I had sort of access to this other kinds of women's mobility that was taking place, if not exactly in the same region, more or less. These women were moving with Kutchi merchants or slave owners or captains of ships and so on and so forth. And so I was interested in what does this really have to tell us about the way in which, border regulation is sort of managed in a longer time frame, not just in the present, which is so sort of oversaturated by the kind of the post-partition kind of traumas and the current sort of obsession about citizenship and nationality and religion and so on and so forth. And so these three sort of sets of sort of women crossing borders, if you will, became interesting for me to try and sort of work with each other to see where they may sort of take me from the point of view of surveillance and so on and so forth. And now when it comes to surveillance, looking at surveillance as an analytic, I'm also trying to move away from this idea of state surveillance being the most central optic. So in this borderland region, as I've been trying to argue, surveillance is really a sort of multi-directional kind of thing, right? So it's not just that the state is determining who should be let in and who should be let out, but there are multiple forms of surveillance that take place at the level of the family, for instance, at the level of the neighborhood, and particularly when we're talking about the movement of women and the incorporation into families through marriage. There is a lot of boundary maintenance work that is going on, not necessarily at the level of the state, but really at the level of the family, at the level of the extended family, at the way in which kinship networks map out. How are these sort of relationships of endogamy and exogamy managed? So, for instance, Bengali women moving into Kutch, for marriage, they are a very visible category in an area which is entirely sort of marriages are entirely endogamous. So how are these sort of tropes of detection and deception and visibility and invisibility managed, not just vis-a-vis the state as an abstract entity out there, but really in a very sort of grounded way? So that is sort of the way in which I'm working with the current material. I think that one can sort of, to some extent, through these fragments, the archival fragments, try and get a sense of how this was also a contested domain, even at the time, even in the 19th century. There are more sort of narratives that I, haven't necessarily included in my paper of, how women were housed and, occasionally they ran away, occasionally they were sent away, these were sort of, again, I think it was not just a question of the colonial state sort of as the most sort of powerful entity at the time, but also these sort of the merchant networks, as I said, how was all of this managed? This kind of very intricate web of mobility and of visibility, in a sense. How did race, sort of mark you out, perhaps, or how did it allow you a certain kind of facility of movement? Or how did it allow you a certain kind of ambiguity that allowed you to negotiate through different kinds of things? So, okay, so regulation of women's mobility, how, so your question was outside of these forms of regulation as marriage trafficking?
Yeah. The articulation of the question is like the phrase women's mobility suggests agency.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering, like, can you, how much agency are you able to see, whether in the contemporary period or in the historical? Maybe that's the better articulation of my question.
Right. So I think, well, it's hard to say. I mean, I am cautious with attributing agency writ large to everyone here, but what I would try and suggest is that it's more complicated than, you're either married or you're trafficked. I mean, sometimes you're trafficked to be married. Sometimes, the sequence of trafficking has, so particularly the 19th century material shows that the women have sort of undergone multiple movements, and not all of them seem to shut down options of, they sometimes open up in a creative way different kinds of options to them, and they seem to be able to articulate these options. So I think rather than talk about the presence or the absence of agency, I think perhaps there are ways in which we can talk about how, through this kind of regulation, like I said, for surveillance, I mean, it's not just a question of being sort of rendered transparent to the state, but how you can actually work through these categories of deception and detection to manage your visibility or invisibility at a point in time.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting paper and lots of very thought-provoking. I was wondering when you're discussing the the rescued in quotes women from these ships, which I understand are mainly ships of the Kutchi traders themselves at the port city of Bombay or wherever, as opposed to people who were rescued at sea itself, because there was a whole operation on the part of the British to rescue folks from Arab ships, for instance, and they would be brought to the port of Bombay, and you mentioned the African boys, and I'm really interested in that distinction, because some of these boys were taken, for instance, to Nashik, to the asylum there, but there was never any thought, it seems to me, of repatriation, because they were taught to be tradesmen. They were taught Marathi as a language that they would learn. So presumably, because the plan was to just get them resettled in the society, and that's a very different kind of way of thinking about rescued slaves than what you have presented here. So I mean, it's really fascinating. I didn't know about these stories, so just thought I'd share that.
That is fascinating. I have come across references to an African asylum in Bombay too, but I haven't been able to find out very much more about that. So I don't know like who was sent there, etc. But this is fascinating. They were captured on sea too. So the story of Hasina was actually, this ship was, it was apprehended on the high seas somewhere of Yemen. And in fact, that's what actually that's why eventually they had to let them go, because it turned out that they did not have jurisdiction in those waters at the particular point where the ship was apprehended, and the ship's captain was able to sort of use that jurisdictional ambiguity. So yes, it was not just ships that were docked. I mean, they were out on these missions to try and get kind of slave hunting missions. But yes, this is actually fascinating. I have come across only one reference to these African boys who were who were found, but I don't unfortunately know what happened to them. I wasn't able to flourish.
I mean, I've got
Okay.
material on Nashik.
That's fascinating.
There's life stories of these boys. They're, of course, transcribed.
Right.
By
Yes.
The people in the asylum.
Yes.
But there's trying to figure out where they came from, what they look like,
Yeah.
and then of course there's report cards.
Wow.
Intelligent, recalcitrant, all of that. I have them upstairs in my office. I can show them to you.
That's very interesting. I mean, because there are similar reports of women who are, deemed to be of a very passionate nature, and so they're not tamed, and so someone who's now, there's no scope of getting her suitably married because she's sort of past that stage, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to hear this about the boys too. I hadn't realized there was this kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I'm really intrigued by the woman who you met personally, and I know it's a very delicate situation with how she's kind of kept hidden, but something that I would be fascinated is if you got a sense of how she viewed herself. Does she view herself as someone who is trafficked? Does she view herself as a refugee? And also the women who are working to protect her in a sense and keep her in this slave-based marriage, and what are those women telling themselves late at night? Like how are they dealing with the fact that they let this happen and they continue to let it happen in a sense? So I realize I don't know how much you've talked to her. It's very delicate, but that's something that I'd be very curious about.
Thanks. Well, she's only one of many, so actually I have sort of met very many like her. So I'd make a distinction. I mean, this was not, in the present, it's not really a slave-based marriage. I mean, I'm just talking about a different time period where the dominant discourse was of slavery. In the present, so it's very interesting, again, how these different women view themselves. Again, there's no sort of set, it isn't a homogeneous narrative. Different women have different responses. Some will talk much more openly about deception, about the fact that they were deceived, they were tricked into marriage, they were brought by an agent, they were sold, they're very unhappy. They were told they were marrying somebody who, had a factory, and they find that, he's unemployed. I mean, so so there's one narrative of deception and trickery and, and so on. But then there are others, and there are, other narratives have to do with, coming from areas of, tremendous poverty, like many of these women come from. The reason why they are sent far away in marriage is partly because of poverty. Their parents do get money for them. And they talk about other things. They talk about, having, more food to eat than they've ever had in their lives, and so on and so forth. So I think there are different ways in which they sort of view their marriages. In many cases, their marriages entail upward mobility for their husbands, because very often they are married to people, they are married to men who could not find wives in the local context, so they are kind of, men who are generally unemployed, or they're much older men, or they, they're ill, or things like that, right? They couldn't command the cultural capital to get a wife locally. But very often, actually, it's with the coming of these women that they are able to sort of somehow get their act together, and, so it's very interesting how these women are viewed socially within this context. So unlike the kind of the overarching sort of media and, say, police discourse of trafficking and forced marriages, there's a much more subtle social evaluation, and by the women themselves, of their marriage here. It's, it's, as I said, it's different kinds of.
I think we can thank Farhana for the afternoon.
Thank you.